Top 7 Worst Disney Remakes. Have you noticed a pattern with the recent wash of Disney remakes, where none of them are better than their respective originals, and yet they keep making them? Well, we certainly have, and today we're going to take a look at which ones are the worst of them all. I'm Adrian, and let's dive into the top 7 worst Disney remakes. In number 7, we have Alice in Wonderland. So this one might surprise you, but to be honest, I'm putting it on this list less for being a terrible movie and more because it was the one that got this train rolling. Even though it wasn't Disney's first live-action remake of one of their animated classics, it's the first one of the modern era, and its success did convince Disney that they should be going through with making more of these movies. The strange thing is that, on paper at least, this sounds like a winning combination. Tim Burton does Alice in Wonderland, and yet it doesn't work. I'm sure that he had good intentions going into this project, but it doesn't really come to fruition. Wonderland itself appearing very gray and muddy doesn't help. I mean, this doesn't look like a world that I would want to explore. Anyway, Mia was pretty bland as Alice, and it certainly didn't help. And neither does the fact that for some stupid reason, there has to be a prophecy of her killing a dragon to get the story going. It's so missing the spirit of both the original movie and of the book it's based on, it's just aggravating. And with this movie being a harbinger of things to come, it would be remiss of me not to mention Johnny Depp as the Mad Hatter. Again, on paper, this sounds like a good idea, certainly at the time, and yet it still doesn't work. Him being featured so prominently in the marketing reads as very cynical, but the whole Johnny Depp in a stupid hat gimmick wouldn't die as a successful formula until the Lone Ranger went down in flames 3 years later. But that's getting off topic. It's a problem that he gets top billing rather than Alice, who's our POV character and is supposed to have all this impressed on her. What doesn't help is that the rules of this world aren't consistent either. First, reality is a dream for her, then it's not. When she gets to Wonderland, everyone acts like they know her, but this is the first time she went there, but it also might be a sequel to the original. It's just a mess of a movie and certainly not a worthy successor to the original, which proved just the sheer potential that animation could have. Number 6, Aladdin. It's Will Smith. With a blue face, and that's by far this movie's biggest mistake. Little bit of background on the original. The creators of that one were inspired by Robin Williams' stand-up act, and decided to write a role around his high-energy personality, after which they asked him to do a movie with them. After doing some quick test animations around one of his existing performances, Williams said that he laughed his ass off and agreed to do the role. It's worth pointing out that if he had said no, the movie would have been in big trouble, and it's a very real possibility that would have gotten cancelled because of that. Of course, that's not the way events played out. He said yes, and we got a great animated movie out of it. Fast forward 25 years, and they announced the remake, and the casting of Will Smith as the genie. And, I'm not gonna lie here, when I first heard about it, I really thought it was gonna work. Will Smith started his career in comedies. You know, he only transitioned to action movies later on, so we know he can be funny. If he's allowed to work in his own style, that is. That turned out to be a pretty big if, though. The strange thing is, when he's allowed to do his own thing, it actually kind of works, and I feel like this movie might have worked, but then they forced him to do a Robin Williams impersonation, and it really doesn't. They made the character for Robin Williams, and you're kind of asking Will Smith to be Robin Williams, which he's not, so it just doesn't work. But that's just one issue among many. Jafar is probably the most glaring one, who in the original is one of Disney's coolest villains. He's not necessarily complex, but he's threatening, intimidating, and he has a presence. The remake is hilariously miscast and misdirected. This almost feels like a spoof of the original, but one they forgot to bring the jokes for. There are genuinely moments in this movie where the Sultan is more intimidating than Jafar, and even just saying that feels wrong. Moving on, Naomi Scott could actually make for a pretty good Jasmine, but the writing severely lets her down. She gets a whole big song number to herself, singing how she won't go silent, and then gets frozen 10 seconds later and just spends the rest of the climax being Aladdin's cheerleader. How did nobody catch this for its hilarious tone deafness? There's also a weird style issue going on in that it sometimes feels like they're trying to turn it into a Bollywood movie. The Prince Ali song and the impromptu dance sequence over the end credits, incidentally the most high energy and best part of the movie, really give off that Bollywood vibe, but it's like they didn't have the guts to really follow through on that. In a strange way, had they gotten a director from Bollywood who had the courage to make the entire movie in that style, it could have worked. Or maybe not, but at least it would have been unique. Whereas now it tries doing both Bollywood and familiar Disney, and it fails at both. Number 5, Mary Poppins Returns. Let's get something straight here. The only reason this movie isn't higher up on this list is because it has good songs. Some people say they stick a little too close to the original, but it really feels like the songwriters were being truthful when saying that they have a deep affection for the 1964 movie, and this is their love letter to it. For the rest, where do we begin? Yes, technically it's a sequel, but come on, you know it belongs on this list with the rest of them, as was made for the same ignoble reasons as them all. Emily Blunt as Mary Poppins is a strange performance to break down. It's not bad per se, but feels scary at times, which isn't really the idea of Mary Poppins. Lin-Manuel Miranda is another one that's difficult to unpack. He has such innate charm and likability that he's definitely capable of drawing you in, but at the same time, you also can't help but compare him to Dick Van Dyke as Bert in the original, and that's always going to be an uphill struggle. Speaking of, the appearance of Dick Van Dyke himself, 92 years old at the time of recording, is another one that I'm having trouble placing. Technically, not the same character, but son of, they are portrayed by the same actor. Credit to the makeup team on both movies, by the way, because even though they came out 54 years apart, he looks positively identical, and yet it feels manipulative. But Mr. Dawes actually brings up an interesting point, namely the remake's inability to differentiate between an antagonist and a villain. In the original, the bank is the antagonist, yes, but they aren't evil. They're trying to convince Michael to give up his tuppence for something that he shouldn't be worrying about at that age. But in the 2018 movie, the bank wants to forcibly remove them from the house, with Colin Firth as the evil banker doing things that are clearly wrong, but he just wants to win. He's a villain, one without any redeeming qualities, and it really speaks to how this movie doesn't really get the spirit of the original. The wolf in the Royal Doulton Music Hall initially appearing friendly, but immediately giving away that he's going to be evil falls into this category as well, of completely missing the point. That also brings with it something of a pacing issue, because there are a lot of times between the songs where it feels slow and almost boring at points. Even though this one is actually 8 minutes shorter than the original, it feels long, and that's never a good sign. Number 4, we have Dumbo. Funnily enough, this movie has much the same issue that the previous entry on this list did. It feels long. Unlike Mary Poppins Returns though, Dumbo feels long because it is long. The original is only 64 minutes, and somehow they have to pad that out into nearly 2 hours. And that's very apparent. They get acting giants like Colin Farrell, Ava Green, Michael Keaton, and Danny DeVito to fill it out, and yet the two children give some of the blandest performances I've ever seen. I know, kid actors go a little easier on them, but even by that standard, these two are pretty bland. Not even the trailer of the movie could make it look like they were interested in what was going on, and that's a big issue. But that's the overall takeaway from this movie. With the movie being nearly twice as long as the original, there's too much focus on the side stuff and not enough on the main wonder of this movie, Dumbo. It's too concerned with explaining the mechanics of it all, which will come up again in the next movie on this list, that it loses the excitement of seeing a flying elephant. Yes, credit where it's due, this movie does walk back some of the, let's be generous and call it problematic aspects of the original, but that doesn't excuse this movie. It's an attempt by Disney to sanitize their own history, but they polish this movie down so aggressively that it ends up being completely flat. What a shock. Part of the value of art is as a time capsule, and by trying to wash their hands of it, it ends up running into the opposite side of the same coin. The original came out before the US had even joined World War II. It's so old, of course aspects of it aren't going to stand the test of time to our modern sensibilities, but removing the crows is not the way to atone for past sins. It just puts a spotlight on the original and draws attention to the problems that had. Number 3, Beauty and the Beast. A remake of one of Disney's very best movies never stood a chance of being good, and yet it still baffles me how not good this one turned out. Emma Watson as Belle might have been workable, she definitely looks the part, but it breaks down on execution. Not dubbing her singing was a big mistake, as she can't carry a performance where 3 of the 4 most emotional moments she has are portrayed by song. The script sugarcoats it a little bit, but Emma Watson, you cannot sing. I'm sorry. Worse is that the songs she has are timeless classics, and there are better versions of them out there. Versions that everybody knows and sung by a much better singer. Apparently Paige O'Hara, the voice actress of Belle in the original, did actually coach Watson on singing, but it clearly didn't work. Put them side by side and it really becomes apparent how much her performance doesn't work. Unlike Belle, who has barely changed from her original interpretation, pretty major changes were made to the character of the Beast. Unfortunately, nearly all detrimental. This Beast is honestly a jerk, and while he should start out that way like he does in the original, the one in the remake stays a jerk all the way through. The change to give the scene where he moves her from a cell to a much nicer room is given to the servants instead, and this is a huge red flag, because now this movie is missing the foundation for the 2 main characters to build a relationship on. This flounders again later on where he shows Belle the library. Rather than doing so as a thoughtful token of his affection, this time it appears to be showing off how many books he has. This remake is also one where they go to the greatest lengths to address what I call Reddit criticism. Minute issues that don't really matter, but by addressing them, the movie only highlights how it still doesn't work. Issues like, why did the servants get cursed too? Why does it take different lengths of time to travel between the castle and the village? Why did the beast come back to life at the end? But the thing is, none of these issues really matter in the grand scheme of things. This is a movie with talking clocks and candelabras, and the protagonist is a 9-foot amalgamation of equal parts lion, bear, and buffalo. You're allowed to answer stupid, nitpicky questions like that with, it's just magic. The 2017 version of Beauty and the Beast is a great example of how remakes shouldn't be done. The 1991 movie drew heavy inspiration from the 1946 movie by Jean Cocteau, more so than the original fairy tale, published almost 250 years before, and the story itself is probably older than that. That's the thing about remakes. They work when they offer a different outlook. This movie is so similar to its predecessor that it has no room to leave an impression of its own, and the few things it does try to change only make it worse. Speaking of which, number 2, The Lion King. This one was doomed from the start. As soon as they announced that James Earl Jones would be reprising his role as Mufasa, I had a feeling this one was gonna be bad. For the record, he was 87 when he did the voice for this one, and it shows. His voice in the original is as rich as lava cake. But here, he sounds tired, and like he's just going through the motions, which I don't think he actually was. But it's fitting, considering what the rest of the movie's like. This is the movie that probably has the fewest changes from the original, which was a major source of criticism. Nala is one of the few characters who did get an overhaul, but definitely for the worse. Rather than being Simba's partner in crime as a troublemaker, now she's the responsible one because we can't have a girl in a movie who likes to have fun. The big selling point is supposed to be that they got Beyoncé to voice her, but that doesn't really mean much when she doesn't play a fun character. She has this rivalry with the leader of the hyenas, which never is given room to blossom into an interesting story because, again, we're tied to the original. So it always feels like a tacked-on afterthought rather than a meaningful subplot to make the experience richer. Worse off is Zazu, voiced by Rowan Atkinson in the original and by John Oliver in the remake. I respect John Oliver for his work on Last Week Tonight, but he is unfathomably awful in this movie, where he almost sounds like himself mocking other people with a strong British accent. This movie has one other really frustrating aspect, and it's the animation. The reason I say this one is frustrating is because it isn't bad. In fact, it's world class. They went for a look of photorealism, and that's most definitely what they got. Every shot in this movie looks like it could have come straight out of a BBC Planet Earth documentary. Problem is, they're not making a documentary, they're making a movie. It's a story in which characters are supposed to be emotional so that we can feel with them, but none of them have any kind of readable emotions. The environment also suffers. Yes, it looks good on paper, but it's surprisingly difficult to distinguish between the rich and luscious pride lands of the first act and the barren pride lands of the third act. But to me, the biggest failure of realism versus storytelling comes in at the stampede scene. In the original, the wildebeests act almost more like a tidal wave, which makes them terrifying. No, an actual herd wouldn't move this fast or this dense, but that doesn't matter. They have to be scary. Remake Stampede moves so slow and the animals are spaced so far apart that there's barely any sense of danger to them. Yes, it's closer to how a herd of wildebeest would move in real life, but that shouldn't be the focus. Friggin' we have talking animals! This altar of ultra-realism that the remake has gutted itself on comes at the expense of everything else, and it wasn't necessary. At least, the reaction to this remake was somewhat encouraging, as a lot of people seem to feel the same way, and yet, it still made a ton of money, clocking in as the 7th highest grossing movie of all time, which is so discouraging. It would have been the top contender for the number 1 spot on this list, until 1 year later, when we got number 1, Mulan. Yes, this one is the winner, and it probably doesn't come as a surprise to the ones who have seen it because it was bad. The original Mulan has amassed quite the following over the years, and it's easy to see why. The story is simple enough for kids to follow, and yet there's enough depth to keep it engaging for adults. It has funny comedic relief, catchy songs, great animation, and a great main character in Mulan herself. So, to see that get boiled down to... this is just painful. Let's mention everything that isn't in this movie. There's no Mushu, there's no Li Shang, which is a problem, and there's no songs. If you cut out that much, you're gonna lose something, and it's the soul of the movie. But then again, I've railed against the others on this list long enough for them being too similar to their original counterparts, so Disney changing stuff shouldn't automatically be a bad thing. And it's not. Here they bring up the concept of chi. And let's not be coy about it and just call it the Force, because that's what it is. They added a sorceress who occasionally shows up but doesn't really change the conflict at all, because once again, they had to stick to the original movie. But by far the worst change they make is to Mulan herself. The original Mulan is an amazing character who is clumsy but likable. She has a sense of tradition but also wants to forge her own path. That's interesting and honestly one of the best role models Disney has ever put to film. This Mulan is already a sword-swinging parkour, archery, hand-to-hand combat expert, and Jedi Master level Force user by the time the movie opens. From a writing perspective, this is terrible, because she has nowhere to go. Growth is what makes a character interesting to watch, but this Mulan can't grow into a better person because she's already perfect. The hero's journey is a concept for a reason, and this movie just flat out ignores every aspect about it. But all of that sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? So what exactly cinches this movie the #1 spot on this list? Well, unfortunately, it's the politics. The fact that this movie was filmed at least partially in the Xinjiang region of China, where ethnic minorities are being violently suppressed by the Chinese government, doesn't help. But what's worse is the fact that Disney apparently didn't care. The fact that they removed Li Shang not because the character was bad, but because a lot of fans read a hint of bisexuality into him, and the Chinese government doesn't like that, is bad. Disney really sold themselves out more than usual, all to appease the Chinese market, and in a surprising twist, it didn't work. Tinfoil hat conspiracy time. I think Disney knew this movie was bad because while they pushed back Black Widow for almost 2 years due to the pandemic so that it could get a theatrical release, Mulan was the first big movie pushed straight to Disney+, and boy did that backfire. This movie was a huge loss. They were probably counting on a bigger success in China, but both critics and audiences there didn't like it, so it tanked pretty hard. Hopefully this will teach Disney a lesson about these remakes, but given the lineup of movies still to come, I doubt it. But you know, that's it. The worst that modern Disney has to offer so far. What are your thoughts? Do you agree with this list? What are your thoughts on the upcoming ones? Do let us know in the comments below, and while you're there, hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss our weekly videos. And remember, Frederator loves you.